My mother said it while I was folding laundry in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in March 2022, after I'd mentioned, tentatively, that I was thinking about leaving my stable but unfulfilling corporate job to start my own business. "You're completely useless at anything that actually requires real follow-through," she said, not even looking up from the mail she was sorting. "You'll fail within 6 months, the way you fail at everything else you've tried." I set down the shirt I was folding, looked at her directly, and said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "You'll regret that." A lifetime of being called useless. My name is Alicia Ferreira, and I was 29 years old that March afternoon, standing in my mother Carmen's kitchen in Fresno, California, absorbing a specific insult that, while genuinely painful in that particular moment, also represented the culmination of nearly 3 decades of similar characterizations I'd absorbed across my entire life. I need to explain the specific pattern that made my mother's comment land with such particular, cumulative weight, because it reflected considerably more than a single moment of parental frustration or cruelty. My mother had, across my entire childhood and into my adult years, maintained a consistent, if rarely directly acknowledged, characterization of me as somehow fundamentally lacking in competence and follow-through. A characterization that stood in fairly stark contrast to my own actual track record, which included graduating college with honors, building a genuinely successful 8-year career in marketing analytics, and maintaining, throughout my 20s, a level of personal and professional stability that, by most external measures, contradicted her persistent framing considerably. I want to explain, with some specific examples, how this pattern had manifested across the years, because I think understanding its consistency matters to understanding both my mother's specific comment that March afternoon and my own eventual response. My mother had criticized my choice of college major, marketing, rather than the nursing degree she'd pushed for, as impractical and predicted, explicitly, that I would never find real, stable work in the field. She had criticized my decision to move to a different city for my first job as running away from real responsibility. She had criticized my decision to remain single through my mid-20s, rather than prioritizing marriage, as evidence that I didn't understand how to actually build anything lasting. Each of these predictions, notably, had proven considerably inaccurate. I built a genuinely successful career, thrived in my new city, and eventually met my now husband, Marcus, at 27, building a genuinely stable, happy relationship that bore little resemblance to my mother's implied predictions of romantic failure. The specific conversation. I want to walk through, in more detail, the specific conversation that led to my mother's comment that March afternoon, because understanding the full context matters to understanding both her reaction and my own eventual response. I had mentioned, somewhat tentatively given my mother's established pattern of criticism regarding my career choices, that I'd been developing a business plan for a specialized marketing analytics consulting firm, a venture that would draw directly on my 8 years of corporate experience. Offering data-driven marketing strategy, consulting specifically for mid-sized regional businesses that typically couldn't afford the kind of large agency services I'd spent my career providing to major corporate clients. I had, at that point, already spent nearly 6 months developing this business plan carefully and methodically. Market research, financial projections, initial conversations with several potential early clients who had expressed genuine interest, and a considered financial plan that would allow me to maintain roughly a year of personal financial runway while building the business's initial client base. My mother's reaction to hearing this plan, delivered in the specific, dismissive tone I'd absorbed across decades, moved quickly past any genuine engagement with the actual substance or planning I'd invested into the idea, directly toward her characteristic prediction of failure. "You're completely useless at anything that actually requires real follow-through," she said. "You'll fail within 6 months, the way you fail at everything else you've tried." What I said, and what I meant by it. I want to be honest about the specific, complicated meaning behind my response. "You'll regret that," because I think it's important to clarify that this wasn't a dramatic, vengeful declaration in the moment, but rather a quieter, more determined statement of intent that I myself wasn't entirely certain, at the time, exactly how I would eventually fulfill. "You'll regret that," I told her, my voice steady despite the genuine hurt I was processing in that moment. "Not because I'm going to prove you wrong out of spite, Mom, but because I'm genuinely going to build this business successfully, and I think you're eventually going to have to reckon with how consistently you've underestimated me across my entire life, not just about this specific business." I want to be honest that I left my mother's house that afternoon uncertain exactly what shape this eventual regret might take, motivated less by a specific plan for vindication and more by a genuine, deep determination to prove, to myself as much as to her, that her characterization of me as fundamentally lacking in competence and follow-through simply wasn't accurate. Building the business. I want to detail the actual, considerable work I invested into building my consulting business over the following 2 years, because the specific, sustained effort involved matters to understanding both my eventual professional success and the broader significance of my mother's earlier dismissive prediction. I formally launched Ferreira Analytics Consulting in June 2022, 3 months after that difficult conversation with my mother, having used the intervening period to finalize my business plan, secure initial funding through a combination of personal savings and a modest small business loan, and significantly, convert 2 of my earlier informal client conversations into my first 2 formal consulting contracts. I want to describe the genuine, considerable difficulty of those first several months, the exhausting work of building a client base from essentially nothing, managing the countless administrative and financial demands of running an independent business for the first time, and navigating genuine uncertainty about whether this venture would, in fact, succeed or ultimately validate my mother's dismissive prediction. By the end of my business's first year, in mid-2023, I had built a client roster of 11 regional businesses, generating revenue that, while still modest relative to my previous corporate salary, demonstrated genuine, sustainable traction rather than the 6-month failure my mother had confidently predicted. The business's continued growth. I want to detail the business's continued development across its second year, because this sustained growth became directly relevant to the eventual situation that gives this story its specific, meaningful resolution. By mid-2024, roughly 2 years after my mother's original comment, Ferreira Analytics Consulting had grown to a client roster of 28 regional businesses, had hired 2 additional analysts to help manage this expanding client base, and had generated annual revenue that, for the first time, meaningfully exceeded what I had previously earned in my corporate marketing position. I want to be honest that I did not, across this entire period of building and growing my business, maintain particularly close contact with my mother, our relationship remaining genuinely strained following her original dismissive comment and my own determined, if initially uncertain, response to it. We maintained basic, limited contact, occasional holiday gatherings, brief phone calls, without any deeper engagement regarding my business's actual progress, since my mother had never directly asked about it, and I had, for my own part, felt little inclination to proactively share updates with someone who had responded to my initial excitement with such dismissive certainty of failure. My mother's own financial crisis. I want to explain the specific circumstances that eventually brought my business's success directly, unavoidably into contact with my mother's own life, because this connection became central to the story's eventual resolution. My mother, who had worked for over 2 decades as an office manager for a small regional manufacturing company, learned in early 2025 that her employer was undergoing a significant restructuring that would eliminate her position, part of a broader company downsizing driven by declining regional manufacturing demand. This layoff, arriving when my mother was 58 years old, created genuine, significant financial uncertainty for her, insufficient retirement savings to comfortably retire early, and genuine difficulty, given both her age and her fairly specialized office management experience, finding comparable employment within the specific, narrow regional job market where she'd built her entire career. How my business became relevant. I want to detail the specific circumstances through which my own business's growth eventually became directly connected to my mother's employment crisis, because this connection unfolded through a genuinely unplanned, almost coincidental sequence of events rather than any deliberate orchestration on my part. One of my consulting firm's newer clients, a mid-sized regional distribution company, mentioned during a routine consulting engagement in early 2025 that they were struggling to find a qualified office manager for their expanding operations team. A position requiring exactly the kind of organizational and administrative experience my mother possessed, developed across her own 2 decades in a genuinely comparable role. I want to be honest about my own complicated reaction upon learning of this specific opening, recognizing immediately the genuine, almost surreal coincidence connecting my business's growth directly to a potential solution for my mother's employment crisis. A connection I hadn't sought out or anticipated, but that nonetheless presented itself clearly through the ordinary course of my professional work. The decision to help. I want to explain the specific, considered decision-making process I engaged in regarding whether and how to connect my mother with this potential opportunity, given the genuinely complicated history between us. I discussed this situation extensively with Marcus, working through genuine ambivalence about whether reaching out to help my mother, given everything that had happened between us, actually made sense, or whether it risked feeling like some kind of manipulative, "Look how successful I've become," gesture rather than genuine, uncomplicated support during a difficult time in her life. "I think," Marcus told me during one of these conversations, "you can offer this connection genuinely, as an act of real care for your mother during a difficult time, without that generosity requiring you to pretend the earlier hurt never happened or doesn't still matter. Those two things aren't actually in conflict with each other." I ultimately decided to reach out to my mother directly, informing her of the potential opening at my client's company, offering to make an introduction given my own professional relationship with the business, without initially revealing the full extent of my role as their ongoing consulting partner. My mother's reaction. I want to describe my mother's reaction upon learning the fuller context of this opportunity, because it produced the specific, meaningful moment this story's title ultimately references. My mother interviewed successfully for the position and was offered the role in February 2025. It was during her formal onboarding process, roughly 2 weeks into her new position, that she learned, through casual conversation with her new manager, the fuller context of how this opportunity had actually come about, that the company's marketing analytics consulting partner, whose strategic guidance had directly contributed to the company's recent growth and corresponding need for expanded administrative staff, was, in fact, her own daughter. My mother called me that same evening, her voice carrying a complicated mixture of emotions I hadn't previously heard from her across our entire relationship. "I just found out," she said, "that the consulting firm helping grow the company I now work for is yours. Alicia, I had no idea your business had grown into something this substantial, this successful. I don't know what to say." The conversation that followed. I want to describe the extended conversation that followed this initial call, because it represented the fullest, most direct reckoning my mother and I had ever had regarding her original dismissive comment and the years of similar pattern that had preceded it. "Mom," I said, "I need you to understand something. I've spent the past 3 years building this business specifically because I refuse to accept your characterization of me as someone fundamentally lacking in follow-through. I don't say that to be cruel now that things have worked out. I say it because I think you need to actually understand the real, lasting weight your words carried, both that specific day and across my entire life leading up to it." My mother's, notably, did not respond with the defensive minimization I might have expected based on her previous reactions to similar conversations across the years. "I think," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion, "I've spent years telling myself various versions of tough love, believing I was somehow motivating you by setting a high bar and expressing doubt when you fell short of it. But sitting here now, in a job I got because of your genuine professional success. A success you built entirely despite my discouragement rather than because of any support I offered. I don't think I can keep telling myself that story anymore. I was wrong, Alicia. Not just about this business specifically, but about a pattern I maintained across your entire life. One that I think caused you real, lasting harm rather than the motivation I always told myself I was providing. What this admission actually meant. I want to be honest about my own complicated reaction to finally receiving this direct, genuine acknowledgement, because I don't think it simply, instantly resolved decades of accumulated hurt, however meaningful the admission itself genuinely was. I appreciate you saying this, I told her. But Mom, I need you to understand that this doesn't erase almost 3 decades of consistently being told I was useless, that I would fail, that I didn't understand how to build anything lasting. I'm genuinely glad this opportunity worked out for you, and I'm glad we're finally having this honest conversation. But rebuilding real trust between us is going to take considerably more than one difficult conversation, however genuine. The working relationship. I want to detail the somewhat unusual, ongoing professional dynamic that emerged from this situation. Since my mother's continued employment at my consulting firm's client company created an ongoing, if indirect, professional connection between us. I made a deliberate decision to maintain appropriate professional boundaries regarding my consulting relationship with this client, ensuring my mother's employment and performance evaluation remained entirely within her own direct management structure, without any inappropriate involvement or influence from my own separate consulting role. A boundary I discussed explicitly and transparently with both the company's leadership and my mother herself. Wanting to ensure her position and ongoing employment reflected her own genuine performance and qualifications, rather than any family connection to their outside consultant. My mother, notably, has performed genuinely well in this role across the following months. According to feedback I've received indirectly through my ongoing, professionally appropriate consulting relationship with the company, a performance that reflects her own genuine, long-standing administrative competence rather than any special treatment connected to our family relationship. Epilogue. It has been just over 3 years since that difficult Sunday afternoon in my mother's kitchen, when she told me I was completely useless and predicted my business would fail within 6 months, and just over 6 months since she learned, through genuinely unplanned professional circumstance, the full scope of what that business had actually become. My relationship with my mother has been rebuilding, gradually and imperfectly, across the months since her genuine, direct acknowledgement of the harm her long-standing pattern of doubt and dismissal had caused. We speak more honestly now than at any previous point in our adult relationship, though I want to be clear that this rebuilding remains an ongoing, deliberate process, rather than a simple, complete resolution achieved through one significant conversation. I think often about the specific, quiet determination behind my response that afternoon. You'll regret that. A statement I made without any clear, specific plan for how I would eventually prove it true, motivated more by a deep, accumulated refusal to accept a characterization that had never actually matched my genuine capabilities and effort, however consistently my mother had insisted otherwise across my entire life. Ferreira Analytics Consulting has continued growing in the time since, now serving over 40 regional clients with a team of 5 analysts supporting my own continued leadership of the business. I don't think of the company's success primarily as vindication against my mother's original prediction anymore, though I won't pretend that motivation didn't genuinely drive me during those difficult early months of building the business. I think of it now simply as the tangible result of exactly the kind of sustained follow-through and competence my mother had once confidently insisted I fundamentally lacked. Proof, ultimately, not that I needed to prove anything to her specifically, but that her characterization was never actually true in the first place, regardless of whether or how she ever came to fully recognize that herself. The end.